Hello from New York. Welcome to Media Snack Live.
Live from London.
And I say hello from New York. I was just obsessing about that rather than the name of the show. Just because it's July 3rd, and that's technically kind of July 4th because July 4th is the weekend this year. So if you're celebrating and you're in the US, happy 4th of July whenever you get to watch this. So welcome back to Media Snack Live. We are continuing our Media for Growth series, which has really dominated everything that we've been talking about really this year on every episode. It's about how we can repurpose media to be a lever for business growth and be focused on business outcomes. And we're considering lots of different implications and adjacent things around that. One thing we wanted to focus on this week is culture. And so we're going to talk about the culture of media. It was prompted somewhat last week. We did the episode 171. If you go back, you can have a look at last week's episode. We were talking about the role of procurement, marketing procurement in growth, and particularly discussing the relationship between marketing and procurement. And there's some kind of cultural elements to that sometimes because there's often different types of people. And we had some great guests, Laura from WFA and Kevin from Hershey, that had given us some really good tips around these kind of things. So you should go watch that. It's a very, very good episode. Got some amazing feedback on that. It also prompted a number of questions as follow-ups, which made us want to delve a bit further into the kind of cultural side of marketing. And particularly that was initially kind of in reference to this idea of in-housing, but also a broader discussion about how to achieve better diversity on all sides within marketing, within corporations, within agencies, and the whole supply chain. You know, and let's just think about how far we've come actually, and then what more there is to go, because there's still a long way to go. We are very, very lucky this week. We have a very special guest, a good friend of ours, Belinda Smith, who, hey Belinda.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi, Belinda.
So Belinda will join us in about 10 minutes or so. So if you're bored of David and I, you can skip ahead to that if you're watching this on repeat. But Belinda calls herself a marketing and diversity activist now, which is great. And so she has very good perspective across a number of these areas that we're going to talk about. Internal marketing organizations, in-housing, diversity within corporate cultures and things like that. So we're looking forward to that. So let's get to that quick.
Yeah.
We're going to speed through today our bit. So, right, let's think about the culture of media, mate. What is going on?
So the culture of media. When you and I first started our careers decades ago, we both started at media agencies, and I think it would be probably fair to say that the culture at those places at that time was fairly rudimentary. You know, it was a bit of a boys' club. Most of the agencies had come from kind of buying shops within the kind of the creative agencies, and so there was a fairly kind of basic kind of culture around trading. There wasn't a more sophisticated consideration of media within those organizations. Now, the agencies have gone a long way since then. There's still work to do, but they made significant progress since we were first in the industry. But the focus now is even greater. And if we talk about media being higher on the corporate agenda than it's ever been before, and the focal point of businesses on driving better media improvement because it drives a media goal, then the focus should also be on nurturing and amplifying a more positive media culture, both within agencies and also within organizations, brand organizations. Now, we talked last week, I was fascinated by the narrative that Kevin from Hershey talked about in terms of the connection that he has with his marketing and media team to enable them both departments to succeed within that organization. You can see how that collaboration can nurture really positive kind of culture within a kind of a marketing team. 2 episodes ago, we had Gerhard Lowe from Lindt come and talk to us about in-housing. Yeah. Now, as more and more brands begin to start considering what to build internally with regards to kind of media, both media planning and media activation, the role media culture within an organization becomes even more important, because what you can't do is just plonk some buyers at a desk and then hope that they will integrate themselves within a marketing organization. It needs to be engineered. The environment needs to be nurtured in the way that the agencies have nurtured their own kind of internal cultures in order for that to kind of succeed. So, that's why it's so important to focus on culture over and above and in addition to the operational side of media within brand organizations.
Yeah, agree. Good.
So, Tom, what are the implications then?
So, the first thing, I'll start with the kind of the diversity question, because, and the reason that as well, you hopefully get appreciation within this episode. I mean, the diversity challenge to the industry, which is a good challenge, can't just sit in isolation. It's not one thing to solve, although it's a highly important thing to solve. There's a bigger consideration of the culture of media. As you said, it's evolved from being a very buying culture now to being much closer, closer part of the business, driving business outcomes. And actually, there are relationships and understanding and diversity required across many kind of parts of the business to enable us to function better and really just be more representative and therefore more effective. To start just with the diversity, there's obviously clearly still ways to go. As a communications industry, we have to be more representative of the people that we're trying to communicate to, or the people that we're trying to sell to, or trying to kind of generate action from. Karen Blackett from WPP famously said, diversity is the solution and not the problem. And I always like that idea, because that's really what companies should be aspiring to, is to find new solutions. And then new solutions, the opportunities for agencies perhaps, and Karen's on the agency side, it's a differentiator. It's something you have to do and you should want to do, because it will make you a better agency. So there's competitive advantage at the very least that comes from that from a business perspective. But we have to make our companies more representative. There are implications to the way that we kind of do business and how we can affect change. We have to hold the supply chain. I mean, if you're in any position of influence, from the marketer all the way through what we perhaps disparagingly call the supply chain, but everybody kind of knows what that means, is everybody kind of servicing the needs of the marketer all the way till it touches the consumer. We have to hold that whole supply chain, but especially agencies perhaps, because they're really often at the front of that chain, to better account for their diversity. And it's good. I think we're making progress. I mean, we'll hear Belinda's views on this, because I know she thinks that she's got mixed views on the effectiveness of agency communication around this stuff. But it's good, I think, that we've got agencies at least making their policies more public and clearer. We've got agencies committing to share information and data about these things. And obviously, most of the agencies are part of large public groups, and they make these disclosures, and that's all good. From the marketer's perspective, we've got to be able to use that to hold the supply chain to better account, and marketers to be making decisions not wholly based on that, but it's got to be now a more significant part of the decision making. That's it. That's where the power sits, is how we can affect change. And finally, just to reference the in-housing, the implications of not thinking about cultural integration, and we're talking here about those companies that have tried in-housing and failed have tended to be because they just hired a whole bunch of techie buyers, given them some access to some buying tools, and they've sat somewhat separate from the core marketing function, and not a lot of attention has been paid to try and integrate those things. And culturally, perhaps quite different. If you think about your a programmatic buying unit, or a social media buying activation, or search buying, whatever you might want to be in-housing, there's a cultural gap, but maybe also an education gap between them and the brand marketers. So that's something that we've got to do to avoid what Belinda calls, which she said on the podcast that we did last year, organ rejection, which is a really nice way of explaining what happens when you start trying to build an in-house team without really thinking about where it's going to live inside the marketing org. Okay. There's some implications. There's things to be done and things that we need to do. Generally, more consideration, I think, needs to be made into those kind of cultural impacts. So specifically for the marketer, as always, what, mate, do we think that marketers should be doing?
Well, I think the first thing, and we've talked a lot about kind of changing the narrative around media internally, and combining procurement and marketeers, media leaders, to champion the power of media within an internal organization naturally emboldens and builds the right kind of cultural kind of narrative internally. That's really important. It's about value. It's about driving business growth. It's not about cost reduction, and it's not about savings any longer. So again, that combination, I keep coming back to kind of the way that Kevin talked about his integration collaboration with his media teams to share that same narrative, that single point of view that talks about media within the value proposition rather than within the cost proposition is absolutely kind of critical. That's the first thing. The second thing is interrogate your agency providers more intelligently around their diversity principles, their policies. We include that as a component of our pitch processes. And from an agency perspective, in a marketplace that is frankly lacking in any sense of differentiation, having a clear cultural point of view and a clear cultural DNA is actually what stands you apart from everybody else. So they should be embracing kind of being challenged in more ways. And then the third thing is what you just mentioned earlier on, that sense of organ rejection if you don't establish and nurture the right kind of environment. So for businesses and advertisers that are considering bringing more responsibility and accountability for media management internally, don't just think it begins and finishes with bringing talent in. The operational side is only half of it. You have to create an environment where culture can help grow and facilitate success of that in-housing kind of structure. So think of it broader than just bringing in FTEs.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, listen, let's get to it. I'm very curious for us to be able to hear Belinda speak on some of these things as well. So we'll go straight to that. Hi,
Belinda. Welcome to Media Snack. Belinda, we've known you for a number of years. When we worked together when you were global head of media at Electronic Arts, and we're going to talk a little bit about the culture that I think you managed to establish there. But now you have an amazing title. So you're a marketing and diversity activist, and importantly, you are a diversity ambassador for the WFA, so the World Federation of Advertisers. Can you just tell me a little bit about your role and what you do for the WFA as the ambassador for diversity?
Yeah, this was a little bit of a role that we created actually while I was at EA. While I was at EA, I was sat on the executive committee of the WFA, and I'm sure as both of you are super familiar with the WFA, partners with UN Women, was a founding member of Unstereotype Alliance, does a lot of progressive work around diversity, and really focused around, or had been in the past, really focused around gender. And my perspective, based on where I'm set, is that when we talk about diversity as a gender issue, we usually talk about how can we get more like middle class or upper middle class white women into executive ranks, and we forget about everyone else. So the conversation we had, a few years ago now was, gender is great. Let's continue to champion that. How can we go further and really open the aperture and spread this and think about intersectionality and think about other types of diversity? And yeah, since we're on camera, like you can tell, I'm a Black person. I'm very interested in racial diversity. And advertising and marketing is such a white industry, especially in the US. That was where my passion was. And we really thought, okay, well, I think it's time to really build on this work and grow it into some other areas. And I became at that point the diversity ambassador, which, before real life was canceled, meant that I flew around and spoke at conferences, and attended WFA forums and met with other brands and really talked through these issues beyond gender. Year 2 into that program, it's me and Jerry Dakin, actually, from GFA, who are the ambassadors this year. And we've just started our first task force, diversity and inclusion task force, underneath the WFA. And so Jerry and I are leading the work and thinking, what are the important areas we need to tackle? What is the remit of the group? What are we going to solve? How are we going to measure it? And really making sure that we root that in the experience of a global marketing executive, thinking about how can we drive impact, but how can we also make things that can be readily and quickly adopted by the marketplace and actually facilitate actual change. Yeah,
because there's 2 parts to it. There's probably more parts to it, but we've focused so far in this episode. What we're talking about, the people and the employees and the culture within companies.
Yeah,
you have to recognise that. Then this is very clear in the WFA, is that we are all advertisers. So all of this money is being used to communicate things. As marketers, we can be, I guess, more aware of also then the messages and the way that we communicate things to be more representative, a bit more responsible in the way that we talk. Are you looking at both of those things, both the kind of the cultural internal and also the communications bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I've never used this analogy before, but it just popped in my head. I kind of think of Jerry and I standing back to back, like on Lethal Weapon, and I have my gun pointed at like internal culture and diversity, and Jerry has his gun pointed externally at what are the creative, who are your media partners, what does the supply chain look like? And to be clear, both of us care vociferously about both. I think we kind of tend to naturally gravitate to those. But yes, we're doing both. In the WFA, we're doing both in the task force, and I think, it's a healthy balance, isn't it? It's the creative is kind of the more attractive part. It's more visible to the rest of the world. It's easy to get really obsessed with that, and I think we should be, because creative is a vehicle that really defines what our culture is going to be. Creative has the power to declare something as normal or bad or good. And I think that's really, really important. I have also been in wildly creative organizations where internally the culture was shit. Like, okay, well, we cracked this half and people think much better of us than is my lived experience being an employee at this place. So you have to, it's a balance of focusing on both and making sure that you're lifting both.
Yeah. It's not enough to have, which is maybe where we were, and maybe this is now we're transitioning into kind of a bit slightly more awareness now. We have a bunch of white marketers thinking that the ratios of black people in their ads is a bit low, so that they need to do more, just to kind of hit the numbers and all that kind of stuff. Maybe that's progress that has been made, but now we're talking about internally, and we've got some great CMOs now talking and adding to your voice and others, saying that unless internally you represent the cultures that you're talking to, that and the people that just the consumers that you're talking to, that you can't be as effective, and it's just not right to do that. You can't pretend. You have to start internally. You said to me, we did a podcast at the end of last year, touched on some of these things, and you talked to me because you said about changing internal cultures has to start from the top. And that was really interesting, because all the narrative prior to that I'd been aware of was, you have to try to be a bit more inclusive in your hiring, and it was always a sense that it was from the ground up. But you were the first person that said start at the top, and then this year that's now the prevailing narrative. It's been really interesting because I'm hearing that from lots of other places as well. Just can you mind sharing that again, like with our viewers? Like, why is that? Why do you have to hire at the top, or why should you start at the top?
Yeah, I was just going to say, when we had that conversation, it was in the context of hiring. And that's something I've been really passionate about. People will say, Well, diversity is a pipeline issue, and it means we need to recruit better and we need to recruit differently. And, where can we go find diversity? How do I get diversity? And what happens when you do that, if you're successful, which usually you're not, because it's someone's passion project, they're not being mandated to do that. They just think they should because they're a good person. And when they get busy, that's the first thing that falls off their plate. So usually it's unsuccessful, but if you are successful at it, then great. You have a bunch of people who look different to what's already in your organization coming in the door, and no one has thought about, well, like, what do we do with them? What do they need? Different benefits? Do they need different policies? Do they need different support? Who in business can they even talk to feel heard or to feel like they're having the same experience? And the answer really is no one. And, you've agreed to this really intellectual exercise on paper, but no one has thought beyond that. And so you have a whole cohort of people coming in and you're setting them up to have a really bad experience. Yeah. Conversely, if you focus on hiring at the top, someone at that point in their career is actually more able to understand, hey, we're not good at it yet, but we want to be better. And you're going to press us on that. You're going to need to show leadership and be willing to have uncomfortable conversations with us to hold us accountable for that. And they have the power to make decisions. They have the power to influence budgets. They're so much more prepared and enabled to be effective as opposed to, just going and recruiting differently.
Yeah.
Belinda, just the little kind of question on your role with the WFA. How do you measure success for yourself? I know that you are hugely accountable. You've always have been in whatever kind of roles you've had. But in that ambassadorial role, how are you in a year's time? Are you going to say, you know what, smashed it?
If you guys invite me back, because it's so fun. I don't know. That's a good question. What I will say is, yes, both of you know me very well. I am a measurement czar in some ways. And so I think, like much of the conversation I've seen over the past 3 or 4 weeks, we're definitely saying, well, how do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we hold the industry accountable? How do we measure it, and what does that look like? My personal mission is to be the agitator that gets us beyond, to use a marketing analogy, gets us beyond the vanity metrics. Like, I think about what % of your organization is Black. To me, that's as useful as the click-through rate. It doesn't get us very far. It's easy to manipulate. What is it even telling us anyway? And Tom, you and I have talked about this, but I think there are things like 1 or 2 levels down that we can talk about that actually are really good measurements of diversity and culture and inclusivity. So let's go from what % of your organization is Black to actually across all of your organization and demographics, who's getting promoted, how does pay parity look across those vectors? We're going through mass layoffs globally. Who was most impacted in those layoffs? Et cetera, down the line for that. And I think where these topics merge together is, yes, diversity is important with me because I want to see myself represented in my peers and in the work that I'm doing. But it's also important because I firmly believe the way that you hack this issue is to have a good culture, and that benefits absolutely everyone. So on the flip side, how do you measure this issue? I think it's really, how do we assess whether corporate cultures are getting less toxic over time? And I think a big way to do that is to be able to hear from employees about, how they're rating you.
Yeah. And as a media leader within an advertising, a brand organization, how can you champion that? How do you, and you've done it, I know, at Electronic Arts, but how do you enable that cultural, amplification in a positive way in your role as a media leader within an organization? Yeah,
I think there are a couple of ways, and it's we also should acknowledge that there are multiple and competing media leader setups. Mine was global, which was the entire global team and discipline fed into me. And I think from that perspective, it made it very easy for me to lead by example and kind of like be the change that I wanted to see. Which is to say, you know, if my remit is global and I'm running the global team, the buck stops with me. So start living these practices in my team, rewarding behavior based on that, being transparent about what's important to the team culturally, how we treat partners, how we work with partners, and being very consistent. Another competing framework for managing media is kind of like a center of excellence or an influence model, where you're at headquarters, but you're really trying to influence all of your counterparts in different locales. And then it becomes, I think what I've seen there is really the sharing of best practices, but showing that you understand enough about the market or the region to understand how those practices translate within the region. So not just saying like, hey, I'm from global headquarters center of excellence, and overall we think it's best to do this, but really to say, you know, in Poland, I know we have these unique considerations, and here are some other Polish advertisers I've spoken with, and this might be something that we want to try in that market. So I think in many ways in that type of setup, you're really a champion of insights, of best practices, of what's working well, of keeping all of your peers, you know, armed with the best information, versus the central model that I was in. It's really on you to just put your money where your mouth is and do it. The last thing I'll say is we talked about supply chain a bit, and that was how we met, going through a review. And it's one thing to say that you value these things, but as a global media leader, you have the opportunity to hold people accountable in a contractual way. And if you are saying that this is important to you and you're not using that opportunity to do such, I think that's a massive failure.
Yeah. And are you finding appetite amongst your peers through the WFA that they can use that opportunity? I mean, and let me just explain what I mean. We were referencing it earlier. Is if you're a marketing, let's just say you lead marketing at an organization, and as you said, a lot of marketers have spent the last couple of years under good instruction and support with trade bodies to be making sure that their communications are more representative.
Yeah.
But then maybe looking at their own internal, but also then they may not have a responsibility for the supply chain, but they must acknowledge that they have the influence and the privilege to be able to influence a huge, wide industry. We're talking $1 trillion industry, you know, with a handful of very powerful marketers at the center. And you know, it's all about the money and where that flows, and they get to make discretionary decisions about that. And so I think this is what you were referencing. I mean, both you and I and David and you know, a number of us are very passionate about trying to create a framework for marketers that allows them to differentiate different suppliers and make culture and diversity a really important, not the only thing, but a much more important part of the decision making, because that allows them to use their influence in a positive way. Okay, and it rises the tide, or whatever the analogy is, you know, but it makes improvements through a very large industry, potentially with a you know, a small center. I mean, WFA is a relatively small group of people, but very influential marketers involved. So what extent do you think, has that been a conversation?
Yeah.
The marketers recognize that influence? I
think this is actually, I mean, technically nothing's bigger than the WFA, but I think this is a conversation that is bigger than the WFA. I remember when Antonio Lucci was at HP. And
now at Facebook.
Yeah, now at Facebook. And what's Facebook? I've never heard of that one before. But he, in his review, like he wanted to focus on diversity with his agencies and with his suppliers. And I remember I've never met Antonio, but you know, through friends at HP or friends who do know him, the word on the street was like everyone was pushing back. You can't ask us for that data. It's illegal. We can't give it to you globally. You know, we're not going to take a stance on this. You can't dictate what the makeup of our team is. And he continued to press hard and really fight that fight. And I think for me personally, that was a moment of like, you know what? People will say no, but that doesn't mean the answer is no. And I think we have to push past the first no. And we've all done this in negotiations with any kind of contract. If you're talking about rates or data ownership or trying to get, that one more point from Google or whatever it is, people are going to tell you it's impossible. And I think it's your job to say, no, it is possible. And actually, we can't even go forward until you figure out how to make it work. And again, it doesn't have to be a prescriptive thing about you need X% of this gender, of this race, of this age, or whatever it is on your team. And those things are illegal. But I think it can be as simple as saying, we don't really have an interest in working with partners that don't have a really thought through HR program for how they attack racism in the workplace. And we're not dictating what your position should be, and we're not dictating what your makeup should be, but there are some minimum commitments that you have to sign up for to show that you're operating in good faith. It's the same thing with data hygiene. Like if you're not using, secure, double encrypted, whatever, then we're not going to work with you. And it's the same thing. It's not necessarily telling people that they have to agree with you or how to run their business or who to vote for. But it's just saying these are common sense things that you should have in place for the care of all of your people. And if at some point, we are made aware or we understand that you haven't been doing your diligence in regards to people, we can't work with you anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And we're finding, as you know, we worked with you and your team on a global media pitch to find a new media agency or to find the media agency, and we run a lot of agency pitches. We're finding those are really good opportunities to ask those questions. Yeah. Because sometimes just going cold to the agency and going, and sounding suddenly very inspired and saying like, right, I've got this checklist, like tell me, maybe there's a little bit of resistance from the market.
I will say sometimes, the agency is set up such that whatever the client read on Thursday that they got really excited about on Friday, we've got to figure out how to do it. So that
very good. Yeah.
Well. Yeah. But you're exactly right. And I think the other thing I'll say on the other side of this from having been at an agency is there are people who want to engage in these conversations and want to go deeper in this work. And in some cases, they're waiting for the client to tell them that it's important, and they're waiting for permission from the client to partner on this together. So by even bringing it up as a topic, you're signaling to the agency, like, yes, I'll support you in this work, and I'm interested in figuring out how we make this better together. Yeah.
Good. Listen, we're kind of running out of time because this is we need to keep coming back to this one. I'll link to the podcast that we did where we explored some of these things a little bit more, although it was 6 months ago and the world has changed a little bit since December or whenever it was that we did that. Before we go, Belinda, just, we'd speak every now and again, and I'd be kind of, as David said up front, we're kind of keeping a kind of close eye on all of your reporting and messaging and encouragement. But from your perspective, I mean, what's the last 3 months been like? Because now we were before lockdown, before the acceleration of the Black Lives Matter movement, before the murder of George Floyd, before protests going on around the world, which are kind of hopefully accelerating the changes that we were talking about. Before that happened, diversity was a big thing we were talking about, and you were busy talking about it then. And I remember checking in with you, and it was probably like the beginning of May, and you just were like, "Oh my, head is spinning in a good way." But there's, a lot of roads have kind of led to you, and a lot of people have been kind of coming to you for advice and guidance and perspective. Just what's it been like the last 3 months, and what's your feeling now at the beginning of July of any progress, or what are the positives that you might be able to take from that?
Yeah. So first and foremost, thank you for acknowledging that Black Lives Matter was not created in 2020. That has been a little irritating, but you phrased that exactly right when you said, what's it like for you right now at the beginning of July? Because the experience over the past 3 months, 4 months, 5 months has just been every single day. I feel like it's a different world and I'm a different person, and things are moving so quickly. It's been hard to get a grasp on. I think today, what I'm really encouraged by are the fact that the way this conversation has played out in the last few months, probably because we have all been hyperactive online as we're locked in our house. I have been so just proud and relieved, really, to see people speaking up about their experiences. One of the really tough things before this year with diversity was even making a case for why people should care. I know why people should care because my lived experience is very different than the typical person in this industry. But now we have so many voices illustrating, like, here's an example of what we're talking about. Here's something that happened to me. Here's what I mean. Here's something that's happening currently in the world, and this is how it's impacting me. I think, or even yesterday, I woke up and found out that Periscope, everyone in the agency walked out the door and then released their own like public declaration of independence. It's been wonderful to me to see people finally being in a place where they feel like they can tell their story. I think that's so important to help inform the conversation about what are we solving for? What are we really talking about? What's broken here and what's wrong? Yes, I have been contacted by probably everyone I've ever met professionally. And I think, you know, something that has felt really good is people are not, at least for me, people are not asking me, can you come in and do a training? Can you make a one sheet for us? Can you help us with this speech? People are saying, can you talk to my executive team? Can you talk to my board of directors? Because I think, you know, we're just a long way from really understanding how to walk this road, and we just want to have a conversation. And I mean, I feel like I've been struggling for people to listen to me and take me seriously my whole life. And now, you know, it's here, it's happened. So that's been really great, though, that people are approaching this from the standpoint of, wait a second, we need to have a conversation before we really even understand what moves we should be making. And then the third thing that I'm really excited about is the level of transparency that I've seen pieces of and that I'm trying to support and nurture and grow. I mean, Publicis releasing their data about their demographic makeup, and I mean, it really hurt to see, you know, 7% African American at the bottom and 0.4% at the top. But it's something that we need to know, and it's a conversation we need to have. So I hope that we can continue with that circle of, here's where we are today, here are the experiences people are having, here's how we plan to get better, repeat, repeat, repeat. And I'm so encouraged today and feeling much better than I was in May.
Good. Well, I'm pleased to hear. I like the way you very sensitively called it nurturing, because you're already calling out some of the agencies that have been less forthcoming with their policy in language not suitable for children. But you know, good for you, because I mean, Belinda's, you know, you're a very powerful voice, both in your articulation and also in your position and the respect that you have in the industry, the integrity that you have in the industry. And so you can, you know, why not? You can challenge, you know, at the top levels of these large multinational public companies to get real and to be providing the information that they should be providing. So good for you. Well, so I'm pleased that we find you, you know, in good spirits. Are you you're still hiding in Brooklyn, or have you got out of the city?
No, I don't have the means to not be in Brooklyn, but also this is the best place I could have undergone a quarantine. My bodega's been stocked with Ben & Jerry's constantly. My neighbors and I are on the stoops almost every day. It's been a really tough, but also just like really great experience of neighborhood.
Good. Listen, thank you so much for taking the time today. Also a public holiday as well in the US. So happy 4th of July, even though it's 3rd of July to all of you in the US. So listen, Belinda, take care, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you for joining us.
Lovely to see you, Belinda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I think we've lost Tom. Tom, you're frozen. Right. I'm going to close the episode. Well, listen, thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.